In the dusty Texas town of Millbrook on a sweltering August afternoon in 1867, cattle rancher Jake Morrison rode in expecting to collect payment for his latest drive, but instead stumbled upon an illegal slave auction where a desperate mother named Sarah stood on the auction block with her 6 children, their futures about to be torn apart by the highest bidder. The summer heat pressed down on the crowd of onlookers as the auctioneer called for bids, while Sheriff Coleman stood guard with his hand resting on his pistol, making it clear this business had official protection despite President Lincoln's proclamation 4 years earlier. Sarah's oldest boy, 16-year-old Samuel, caught Jake's eye with a look that cut straight through to something Jake thought had died with his brother at Gettysburg. And without thinking, Jake heard his own voice calling out a bid of $800. The crowd turned to stare at the weathered rancher who had just spent his entire cattle earnings on a family he didn't know. But Jake Morrison had made harder decisions with less reason, and he wasn't about to let his conscience fail him when it mattered most. The gunfire had stopped, but smoke still rose from the buildings scattered across Haven Creek. Jake Morrison stood in the center of what should have been sanctuary, rifle still warm in his hands. Blood seeped through his shirt where a bullet had grazed his shoulder. Around him lay the bodies of men in federal uniforms and expensive suits. Sarah lay motionless near the wooden steps of the general store. Her children knelt beside her, the youngest still calling her name in a voice that would haunt Jake's dreams. 6 pairs of eyes looked to him now, waiting for answers he didn't have. Jake walked to where they huddled. His boots crunched on broken glass. The oldest boy, Samuel, held his baby sister against his chest while tears carved tracks through the dust on his face. "Your mama made me promise something." Jake's voice came out rougher than he intended. "We're going home." Samuel looked up. "Where's home now?" Jake didn't answer because he didn't know. 3 months ago, he'd had different problems. The heat pressed down on Millbrook like an iron on cotton. August in Texas meant the kind of weather that made men short-tempered and horses lazy. Jake had ridden into town expecting nothing more complicated than collecting payment for his cattle drive. $800 waited for him at the bank, enough to fix his roof before winter and maybe buy that breeding bull he'd been considering. He tied his horse outside Miller's general store and noticed the crowd first. Too many people for a Tuesday afternoon. Too quiet for a social gathering. Men stood in a loose circle behind the building, their faces carrying the particular tension that came with witnessing something they knew was wrong but wouldn't stop. Jake walked closer. The circle opened slightly as he approached, recognizing him as a local rancher. What he saw made his stomach clench like a fist. A makeshift platform had been erected from shipping crates. On it stood a woman and 6 children. The woman held herself straight despite the rope binding her wrists. Her children ranged from a boy nearly grown to a girl who couldn't have been more than 4 years old. Sheriff Coleman stood to one side, his hand resting on his pistol. His presence made everything official, legal by some twisted definition of the word. "Do I hear $50 for the woman?" The auctioneer's voice carried across the silent crowd. Strong back, good with children, proven breeder. Jake's hands tightened into fists. The war had ended 2 years ago. Lincoln's proclamation was supposed to have settled this. But here in the shadow of federal law, old business continued under new names. The woman's eyes swept the crowd, not pleading but measuring. She was calculating something, Jake realized. Planning. Even bound and sold, she hadn't surrendered. 60 for the woman and the little ones. A man in a fine suit stepped forward, Louisiana accent thick as molasses. "I'll take the 3 youngest with her." "What about the older children?" The auctioneer gestured to the teenage boy and 2 girls who looked to be around 10 and 12. "Separate lot. I only need workers I can control." The woman's composure cracked for just a moment. She looked at her oldest boy with something like desperation. The boy straightened his shoulders, trying to be brave for her sake. Jake found himself studying the boy's face. Something in those eyes reminded him of his brother Thomas right before Gettysburg. That mix of terror and determination that came when you realized the world was about to split your family apart and there wasn't a thing you could do about it. 75 for the older boy. Another voice from the crowd. "Need hands for the railroad work." The woman closed her eyes. Jake saw her lips move in what might have been prayer. Sold to Mr. Garrett for the boy. The auctioneer raised his hand. Now, what about these two girls? Wait. Jake's voice surprised him. He hadn't planned to speak. The crowd turned. Sheriff Coleman's eyes narrowed. Jake Morrison was known as a man who minded his own business, paid his taxes, and caused no trouble. This was trouble. You got business here, Jake? Sheriff Coleman's tone carried warning. Jake looked at the woman again. She was staring at him now, trying to read his intentions. Her children pressed closer to her skirts. $800. Jake's voice carried across the sudden silence. For all of them, together. The auctioneer's mouth fell open. It was more money than anyone had expected to see. The Louisiana buyer stepped forward, his face darkening. You can't be serious, Morrison. Jake pulled the roll of bills from his pocket. His cattle money, his winter repairs, his future plans. Cash money, right now. The woman's eyes never left his face. She was still trying to understand what he was doing, why he was doing it. Jake wasn't entirely sure himself. Sheriff Coleman moved closer. Jake, you know what you're doing here? Buying what's for sale. These people got to be registered, documented. There's paperwork involved, federal requirements. Then we'll do the paperwork. The auctioneer looked between Jake and the Louisiana buyer, calculating profit margins. $800 was $800 regardless of who paid it. Sold to Mr. Morrison. The woman's knees nearly buckled. Her oldest boy caught her arm, steady despite his own shock. The other children looked between Jake and their mother, uncertain whether this change meant salvation or a different kind of doom. Jake walked to the platform and handed over the money. His hands shook slightly as he counted out the bills. When he finished, he looked up at the woman. What's your name? Sarah. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Sarah Williams. I'm Jake Morrison. These your children? She nodded, still wary. Samuel, Emma, Thomas, Mary, Ruth, and Lucy. She indicated each child in turn. The oldest boy, Samuel, was maybe 16. The youngest, Lucy, couldn't have been more than 4. Well? Jake looked at the 7 faces staring back at him. I suppose you'd better come with me. The ride to his ranch passed in silence. The children walked beside his horse while Sarah carried the youngest. Jake had offered to let some of them ride, but Sarah had politely refused. Trust would take time if it came at all. His ranch house sat in a valley between 2 low hills, modest but well-maintained. Jake had built most of it himself after the war, when he'd needed something to keep his hands busy and his mind occupied. Now it seemed impossibly small for 8 people. He helped them down from the wagon and stood awkwardly in his own yard. The children clustered around their mother, still uncertain. Sarah's eyes swept the house, the barn, the corrals. She was taking inventory, Jake realized, planning again. There's a room off the kitchen, Jake said finally, and space in the loft. We'll make it work. Sarah met his eyes directly for the first time. Why? The question hung between them. Jake looked at her children, at Samuel's protective stance and little Lucy's thumb in her mouth. He thought about his brother Thomas, about promises made and broken, about the kind of man he'd tried to become since the war ended. Couldn't watch them split up your family. Sarah studied his face for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd learned not to trust good intentions. Mr. Morrison, I need you to understand something. We've been sold before, promised things before. Good intentions don't feed children or stop bounty hunters from coming around. Jake nodded slowly. She was right to be cautious. He'd acted on impulse, driven by something he couldn't quite name. Now he had 7 people depending on him and no clear idea what came next. Then I guess we'd better figure out what does. The first week passed like walking on broken glass. Everyone stepped carefully around unspoken rules and uncertain boundaries. Sarah kept her children close, never letting them wander far from her sight. Jake found himself eating breakfast in silence, watching 7 faces that studied his every movement for signs of what kind of man he really was. The neighbors came, calling on the 3rd day. Mrs. Henderson arrived first, carrying a pie that remained untouched on Jake's kitchen table. She stood in his doorway, taking in the sight of Sarah mending clothes while her children sat quietly nearby. "Jake Morrison, what have you done?" Her voice carried the weight of 20 years' worth of church socials and shared community expectations. Jake stood beside his own front door feeling like a stranger. Bought a family their freedom. "You bought yourself trouble." Mrs. Henderson's eyes swept over Sarah and the children with the kind of measuring look reserved for livestock or damaged goods. Sarah continued her mending, needle moving in steady rhythm, but her shoulders had gone rigid. By evening, Jake understood the price of his decision. Tom Brady rode up as the sun touched the horizon, dust trailing behind his horse like a banner of warning. Jake had known Tom since before the war. They'd shared bottles and stories in the comfortable silence of old friendship. Tom dismounted slowly, his deputy marshal badge catching the last light. "Heard you caused quite a stir in town." "News travels fast." "Certain kinds of news do." Tom's eyes found Sarah through the kitchen window. She was teaching little Lucy. Her letters, their heads bent together over a slate board. "People are talking, Jake." Jake poured 2 glasses of whiskey on the porch. They drank in silence while the first stars appeared. Finally, Tom set down his glass with more force than necessary. "The Louisiana buyer is asking questions. Says, you interfered with a legal transaction. Slavery's been illegal for 2 years. There's legal and there's legal." Tom's voice carried the weariness of a man who'd seen too much of both. "Papers get filed, debts get transferred, workers get contracted. Same end, different words." Jake studied his oldest friend's face. "What are you telling me, Tom?" "I'm telling you to be careful. I'm telling you there's federal men asking about runaways and the folks who help them." Tom stood, adjusting his hat. "I'm telling you I can't protect you if you keep walking this path." After Tom left, Jake sat alone on his porch. Through the window, he could see Sarah putting her children to bed in the small room they all shared. Her movements were efficient, practiced. A mother's choreography perfected by necessity. Samuel appeared beside him without sound. The boy had his mother's gift for moving quietly. "That man, he's your friend?" Jake nodded. Samuel settled on the porch step, long legs folding under him. "Friends don't always stay friends when trouble comes." The observation carried more weight than any 16-year-old should possess. Jake looked at the boy's profile against the darkness and saw Sarah's determination mixed with something harder. "You speak from experience?" Samuel's silence was answer. Enough. The decision to leave came 2 weeks later. Jake woke to find Sarah already dressed, packing their few belongings into cloth bundles. Her children moved around her like satellites in careful orbit. "Where are you going?" Sarah didn't look up from her packing. "North, before more trouble finds us here. This is my land, my house. And we're grateful for it." Sarah's hands stilled on little Lucy's dress. "But we can't stay where we're not wanted." Jake thought about Mrs. Henderson's cold visits and the way conversations stopped when he entered Miller's store. His neighbors crossed streets to avoid speaking to him. 20 years of community membership had evaporated in a single auction bid. "Where will you go?" "Kansas. There's a settlement called Haven Creek. All colored families, they say it's safe." Jake studied the packed bundles, the children's faces, Sarah's rigid posture. "What if I came with you?" The question surprised them both. Sarah's hand stopped, moving entirely. "Why would you do that?" Jake couldn't fully explain the impulse that had driven him to bid at the auction, and he couldn't explain this one either. Something about the way Samuel tried to protect his younger siblings, something about Sarah's quiet dignity in the face of impossible circumstances, something about little Lucy asking him to fix her broken doll with the same trust she might show her father. "Maybe because this isn't home anymore without you here." Sarah met his eyes for the first time since Tom's visit. What passed between them wasn't romance or passion, but something deeper. Recognition, perhaps. Two people who'd lost their original families finding something worth protecting in the wreckage. Jake sold the ranch to a buyer from San Antonio. The man paid cash and asked no questions about Jake's reasons for leaving. Within a month, Jake had liquidated 20 years of careful building into traveling money and supplies. They left on a Tuesday morning when the mist still clung to the valley. Jake drove the wagon while Sarah sat beside him, Lucy sleeping in her lap. The older children walked alongside, Samuel ranging ahead like a scout. The first town they reached wouldn't let them stay at the inn. The second had no inn at all. They made camp under stars that seemed larger away from familiar horizons. Around their fire, Sarah pulled out a worn map and traced routes with her finger. Her reading was better than Jake's, her mathematical calculations quicker and more accurate. She planned supplies and calculated distances while Jake tended the horses and Samuel gathered firewood. "You went to school," Jake observed one evening. Sarah's finger paused on the map. "My first owner's daughter taught me letters. Said it was Christian charity." Her voice carried old bitterness. Took it back when she realized I could read her father's business papers. Jake watched Sarah teach Emma to cipher numbers using stones around their campfire. The reversal struck him like physical weight. Here was a woman who'd been treated as property, educating her children by firelight while planning their escape with skills her oppressors had feared to let her keep. "Teach me," he said. Sarah looked up from the map, uncertain she'd heard correctly. "The reading, the calculating I can manage, but you're better." They began meeting after the children slept. Sarah would spread the map between them and explain distances, supply requirements, weather patterns. Jake found himself watching her hands as much as listening to her words. They were capable hands, scarred from work, but gentle when they touched her children's faces. One night, as Sarah showed him how to calculate daily travel against remaining supplies, little Lucy cried out from a nightmare. Sarah moved to comfort her, but Jake was closer. He lifted the child from her blanket and held her against his chest until her trembling stopped. When he looked up, Sarah was watching him with an expression he couldn't read. Something in her face had shifted, like ice beginning to crack in spring water. They were 3 weeks into their journey when the first attack came. Jake woke to Samuel's urgent whisper. Men on horseback surrounded their camp, visible as shadows against the star-filled sky. Jake counted at least 4 riders, maybe more. "Nobody move," a voice called from the darkness. "We're here for the runaways." Jake reached slowly for his rifle, but Samuel's hand caught his wrist. The boy's eyes were wide but steady. "Too many," Samuel breathed. The lead rider moved closer, and Jake recognized the Louisiana accent from the auction. "You cost me money. Morrison. Time to settle accounts." What followed happened fast and brutal. Jake fought with desperate fury while Sarah gathered her children behind the wagon. Gunshots cracked across the prairie like breaking bones. Jake felt fire tear across his shoulder where a bullet found flesh. When the dust settled, 2 riders lay motionless and the others had fled. Jake pressed his hand against the bleeding, wound and surveyed their scattered supplies. Most of their food was gone. The wagon had a broken wheel. Samuel helped Jake bind his shoulder while Sarah counted their remaining resources. Her face was pale but composed. "We can't stay here," she said. Jake nodded through waves of pain. "How far to the next town?" 2 days walking. Among the scattered supplies, Jake found a folded paper that must have fallen from one of the attackers. A telegram with information about their route, their schedule, their plans. Information that could only have come from someone who knew their journey intimately. Jake stared at the telegram until the words blurred together. Tom Brady's name appeared at the bottom as the sending agent. Sarah read the paper over his shoulder. Her hand touched his uninjured arm briefly, offering what comfort she could. "Friends don't always stay friends when trouble comes," she said, quietly, echoing her son's words from weeks before. Jake folded the telegram and tucked it into his shirt pocket. The betrayal cut deeper than the bullet wound, but they had no time for the luxury of feeling it completely. They loaded what supplies remained onto their backs and began walking north toward Kansas, toward the promise of Haven Creek, toward whatever waited at the end of roads that seemed to grow longer with each step. The fever took hold on the second night after the attack. Jake's wound had seemed clean enough, but infection spread through his body like wildfire through dry grass. Sarah found him shivering beside their meager campfire, his skin burning to the touch. She sent Samuel to find water while she tore strips from her own petticoat to make fresh bandages. The children gathered around their makeshift camp, watching. Their mother tended to the man who'd bought their freedom with quiet efficiency. "Is he going to die?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's hands never paused in their work. "Not if I can help it." For 3 days, Jake drifted in and out of consciousness while Sarah fought to keep him alive. She bathed his fevered skin with cool water, forced broth between his lips when he could swallow, and changed his bandages with the careful precision of someone who'd learned medicine from necessity. The children took turns keeping watch. Samuel hunted small game with Jake's rifle. Emma and Thomas gathered firewood and wild berries. Even little Lucy helped by fetching water in a tin cup, her small face serious with responsibility. On the fourth night, Jake's fever broke. His eyes opened to find Sarah sitting beside him, her hand resting on his forehead to check his temperature. In the firelight, her face looked carved from exhaustion and determination. "How long?" His voice came out as a croak. 4 days. Jake tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. His shoulder throbbed and his head spun like a child's top. Sarah's hand pressed gently against his chest, holding him down. "You're not ready. We can't stay here, they'll come back." Sarah's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. "You were talking in your sleep." Jake felt his stomach drop. Fever dreams had a way of bringing buried truths to the surface. "What did I say?" "About your brother. About the war." Sarah's voice was steady, but Jake caught the edge of something underneath. "About why you really bought us." The fire crackled between them. Around the camp, her children slept in the bedrolls they'd salvaged from the attack. Jake closed his eyes, knowing his fevered confessions had probably destroyed whatever trust he'd managed to build. "I didn't save you to be noble," he said finally. "I saved you because I was tired of being angry." Sarah was quiet for so long that Jake thought she might not respond. When she finally spoke, her words surprised him. "Thomas died at Antietam, shot in the back while he was guarding a wagon train full of families like mine." Jake's voice carried old grief mixed with shame. "For 2 years after the war ended, I hated every Union soldier I saw, every freed slave, every person who celebrated what felt like my brother's meaningless death. And now?" Jake opened his eyes to find Sarah watching him with an expression he couldn't read. "Now I think maybe Thomas died for something after all." Sarah's hand moved to adjust his bandage, her touch careful and practiced. "Guilt, love, anger. Doesn't matter why you started, Mr. Morrison. Matters what you choose now." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He'd expected judgment, rejection. The natural response to learning his rescue had been motivated by selfishness rather than heroism. Instead, Sarah offered understanding that felt like absolution. "Why aren't you angry?" "Because my children are free." Sarah's voice was quiet, but firm. "Because you could have walked away a dozen times by now and you haven't. Because intentions matter less than actions, and your actions have been good." Jake watched her face in the firelight. Here was a woman who'd been sold like livestock, who'd seen her family nearly torn apart by men who viewed them as property, offering forgiveness to someone who'd admitted his rescue was born from self-interest rather than righteousness. "I don't deserve that kind of grace." "Maybe not. But my children deserve a chance at life, and you gave them that." Sarah's hand stilled on his bandage. "Sometimes good things happen for selfish reasons. Sometimes selfish reasons turn into something better." Over the following days, as Jake recovered enough to travel, something fundamental shifted between them. The careful politeness that had marked their early interactions dissolved into something more honest. They were no longer master and servant, rescuer and rescued, but two people bound together by shared danger and mutual dependence. Samuel began addressing Jake by name instead of Mr. Emma shared her fears about the journey ahead. Thomas, the middle boy who'd remained silent for weeks, started asking Jake about horses and ranching. Mary and Ruth, the twin girls, included him in their evening games. Little Lucy took to calling him Papa Jake, a development that made Sarah's eyes soften, and Jake's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. They reached the Kansas border on a morning when the sky stretched endless and blue above rolling prairie. The land here felt different somehow, less heavy with history. Jake walked beside the wagon they'd managed to buy in the last town, watching Sarah point out landmarks to her children. "How much further?" Samuel asked. Sarah consulted her map, holding it steady against the prairie wind. 2 days, maybe 3. Haven Creek should be just past that ridge. Jake studied the horizon, noting how the land rolled away in all directions like a green ocean. It was beautiful country, but isolated, perfect for people who wanted to disappear from the world's attention. That evening, as they made camp near a small creek, Sarah pulled Jake aside. Her face carried the weight of something she'd been holding back. "I need to ask you something." Jake nodded, bracing himself. "If something happens to me, what becomes of my children?" The question hit Jake like a physical blow. "Nothing's going to happen to you. You don't know that." Sarah's voice was steady, but Jake caught the fear underneath. "I've been feeling poorly the last few days. Tired in a way that doesn't come from walking." Jake studied her face more carefully. Now that she mentioned it, he could see the pallor under her dark skin, the way she'd been moving more slowly, pausing more often to catch her breath. "It's probably just exhaustion." "Probably." Sarah's eyes met his directly. "But if it's not, I need to know my children will be safe. I need to know you won't take them back to Texas because it's easier. I need to know you'll let them choose their own lives." The intensity in her voice made Jake's chest tight. "Sarah, promise me." Jake looked toward the fire where her children were settling down for the night. Samuel was reading to the younger ones from a book they'd found in an abandoned wagon. Emma was braiding Mary's hair. Thomas was whittling a wooden toy for Lucy. They'd become his family somewhere along the road between Texas and Kansas, not through blood or law, but through shared meals and common dangers and the quiet intimacy of people who'd learned to depend on each other. "I promise." Sarah's relief was visible. She reached out and squeezed his hand briefly, a gesture that carried more weight than any words could have managed. "Thank you." The next morning, Sarah collapsed while loading their supplies. Jake caught her before she hit the ground, feeling how light she'd become, how her breathing came in short, labored gasps. Samuel was beside them instantly, his face tight with fear. "Mama?" Sarah's eyes opened, focusing with effort. "I'm all right, just tired." But Jake could see she wasn't all right. Her skin had a grayish tinge and her pulse fluttered like a bird's wing under his fingers. Whatever was wrong with her was getting worse. They loaded her into the wagon and continued north toward Haven Creek, toward the promise of sanctuary that felt more urgent with each mile. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid enough to give directions, sometimes lost in fevered dreams. "There," Samuel said late on the second day, pointing toward a collection of buildings visible in the distance. "That has to be it." Jake studied the settlement through the afternoon haze. It looked prosperous, well organized. Neat houses lined straight streets. Gardens and corrals suggested a thriving community. But something felt wrong. The buildings were too new, too perfect. No settlement grew that organized without significant resources and planning. Sarah roused herself enough to look. "Haven Creek," she whispered. As they approached the town, Jake's unease grew. The streets were too clean. The residents who watched them pass seemed nervous rather than welcoming. Children disappeared into houses at their approach. They stopped at what appeared to be the town's main building. A man in a suit emerged, flanked by 2 others who carried themselves like hired guns. "Welcome to Haven Creek," the man said. his smile not reaching his eyes. "I'm Mayor Coleman. We've been expecting you." Jake's blood turned to ice. They'd been expected. Somehow their destination had been known in advance. Sarah struggled to sit up in the wagon, her mother's instincts overriding her illness. "We should go," she whispered to Jake. "Now." But it was too late. More men emerged from the buildings around them, cutting off their escape routes. Jake's hand moved toward his rifle, but Samuel's sharp intake of breath stopped him. They were surrounded. Mayor Coleman's smile stretched too wide across his face. Behind him, the men with guns positioned themselves like pieces on a chessboard. Jake counted at least 8 of them, maybe more, emerging from the buildings that lined Haven. "Creek's 2 perfect streets. Mr. Morrison, isn't it?" Coleman consulted a paper in his hand. "And the Williams family. We've been tracking your progress for some time." Sarah struggled to sit straighter in the wagon, her illness forgotten in the face of immediate danger. Her children pressed closer together, Samuel's hand moving protectively toward little Lucy. "This is supposed to be a free settlement," Sarah's voice carried despite her weakness. "Oh, it is." Coleman's tone remained pleasant, conversational. "Free for those who can afford it. Unfortunately, your family has outstanding debts, legal obligations that need to be resolved." Jake's hand inched toward his rifle. "What obligations?" "Transport costs, processing fees, administrative expenses." Coleman folded the paper with deliberate care. Amazing how quickly costs accumulate when you're traveling without proper documentation. The trap became clear. Haven Creek wasn't sanctuary but a processing center, designed to look like freedom while functioning as a marketplace. Families arrived seeking safety and found themselves deeper in debt than when they'd started. "The Louisiana buyer sends his regards," Coleman continued. "He's been very patient, but patience has its limits." Sarah's hand found Jake's arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "The children," she whispered. Jake understood. Whatever happened, next the children's safety mattered more than anything else. He nodded slightly, letting her know he remembered his promise. "There's a simple solution," Coleman said. "Mr. Morrison, you're free to go. This doesn't concern you. The family will be well cared for while their situation gets resolved." The offer hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Jake could walk away, save himself, return to what remained of his old life and pretend none of this had happened. He looked at Samuel's face, at the way the boy stood ready to fight despite impossible odds, at Emma holding the twins' hands, at little Lucy clutching the wooden toy Thomas had carved for her. "They're my family." Coleman's pleasant expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "That's unfortunate." The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Jake felt time slowing, the way it had during the war when violence became inevitable. Sarah's breathing was shallow beside him. The children waited for whatever came next. Coleman raised his hand to signal his men. Jake moved first. The gunfight erupted across Haven Creek's main street like a thunderstorm breaking over prairie. Jake dove from the wagon, rifle in hand, as bullets splintered the wooden seat where he'd been sitting. Sarah rolled toward her children, shielding them with her body despite her weakness. Jake found cover behind a water trough and returned fire. His first shot dropped one of Coleman's men. His second sent another diving for shelter. But there were too many of them, and his ammunition wouldn't last forever. Samuel appeared beside him, having circled around during the chaos. The boy carried a pistol he'd taken from somewhere, his face set with grim determination. "Can you shoot?" Jake asked. "Well enough." They fought side by side, father and son in everything but blood. Samuel's shots were careful, deliberate. Jake's were desperate but effective. Together they held their ground while Sarah kept the younger children safe behind the wagon. Coleman shouted orders from his position near the general store. More men emerged from buildings Jake hadn't noticed before. The trap had been even more elaborate than he'd realized. A bullet caught Jake in the shoulder, spinning him around. He kept firing, knowing that stopping meant death for all of them. Samuel moved to cover his wounded side, the boy's courage matching any soldier Jake had known. Then Sarah cried out. Jake turned to see her falling, a red stain spreading across her dress. She'd been trying to move the children to better cover when a stray bullet found her. Lucy screamed her mother's name, trying to reach her despite Emma's restraining arms. Something cold and final settled in Jake's chest. The last piece of his old self, the part that still believed in rules and fairness and the possibility of peaceful solutions, died in that moment. He stood up from behind the white water trough and walked forward, rifle at his hip, firing with mechanical precision. Coleman's men scattered before his advance, unprepared for someone who'd stopped caring about his own survival. Jake reached Coleman's position and put his rifle barrel against the man's chest. The mayor's pleasant mask finally slipped, revealing the calculating predator underneath. "You're making a mistake, Morrison. I'm a federal agent. This is legal business. Not anymore." Jake pulled the trigger. The remaining gunmen fled or surrendered. Jake stood in the sudden silence, smoke drifting around him like ghosts. His ears rang from the gunfire. Blood seeped through his shirt from the fresh wound. He walked back to where Sarah lay beside the wagon. Her children knelt around her, Samuel trying to stop the bleeding while the younger ones called her name. But Jake could see the truth in her eyes, in the way her breathing had become labored and shallow. Sarah reached for his hand. Her grip was weaker now, fading like evening light. "The promise," she whispered. "I remember. Take them home." Jake knelt beside her, this woman who'd taught him what family really meant. "Where's home, Sarah?" She smiled and for a moment looked like the strong, determined mother who'd stood on that auction block months ago. "Wherever you choose to love them." Sarah closed her eyes. Her hand went still in his. Jake sat in the dust of Haven Creek's Main Street, holding the hand of a woman who'd changed everything about who he thought he was. Around him, 6 children waited for him to decide what came next. Samuel spoke first. "We go back to Texas?" Jake looked at the boy's face, seeing Sarah's strength mixed with his own stubborn determination. "We go home, wherever that is." They buried Sarah in a grove of cottonwood trees outside Haven Creek. Jake carved her name into a wooden marker while the children gathered wildflowers to place on the grave. Samuel said words over his mother that were both prayer and promise. Then they began the long journey back toward Texas, toward whatever version of home they could build together. 1 year later, Jake sat on the porch of a house outside San Antonio, watching Sarah's children play in the yard they'd helped him plant. Samuel worked beside him now, a young man grown tall and serious. Emma taught school in town 3 days a week. The twins helped their neighbors with garden work for pocket money. Thomas had apprenticed with the local blacksmith. Little Lucy, now 5, ran up the porch steps and climbed into his lap. She called him Papa without thinking about it, the way children do when love becomes as natural as breathing. Deputy Marshal Tom Brady rode up the dusty path, his badge catching afternoon sunlight. Jake watched his former friend dismount, noting the careful way Tom approached. "The porch, Jake." "Tom." They studied each other across the distance that betrayal had carved between them. Tom looked older, worn down by whatever guilt he'd been carrying. "I heard what happened in Kansas, about Sarah." Tom's voice was quiet. "I'm sorry." Jake nodded but didn't speak. "I brought something." Tom pulled legal papers from his saddlebag. "Adoption documents. For the children. Make it all official and legal." Tom climbed the porch steps and held out the papers, hope written across his weathered features. This was his attempt at redemption, his way of trying to repair what his betrayal had broken. Jake took the documents and read through them carefully. Everything was properly prepared, officially stamped. With his signature, Sarah's children would become his children in the eyes of the law as well as his heart. Tom waited, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, Jake, but maybe this helps make things right." Jake folded the papers and looked at his old friend, Tom Brady, who'd sold information about their journey for bounty money. Tom Brady, whose betrayal had led to the attack that wounded Jake and ultimately to the trap at Haven Creek that cost Sarah her life. Lucy snuggled closer in Jake's lap, humming quietly to herself. Samuel emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth, ready to defend his family if needed. The other children stopped their play to watch the two men on the porch. Jake stood slowly, still holding the adoption papers. Tom smiled tentatively, thinking reconciliation was possible. Tom? Yeah? Get off my land. And that is all to the story for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.